afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to talk about maps and Clojure, but the geographic kind. So a little bit about me. I'm a front-end developer at Pitch here in Berlin. I work for a team called Team Data Visualization. My Twitter and my GitHub are Joanne Cheng, written at the bottom of this slide, in case you have any questions that you are a little too shy to ask or have any questions during the presentation, and I can get back to you on that. So, as I said before, I'm here today to talk about geographic maps. Some like this, some like the ones we use almost every day, and we see almost every day on the news. Probably like the one that we used this morning while we were trying to find this venue. I find maps really fascinating. A map of an area can be transformed just slightly to show us so many different things about a place. If we look at Berlin, we can see election results for our neighborhood, how our neighbors vote, and neighborhoods that maybe are a little bit different than us. We can also look at radar scans and see the weather for the day, and this tells us what to wear and how to maybe avoid rainstorms if we're biking. This is the analytical side of maps. Analytical because we're seeing data, and maps are a 2D representation of a physical place. They also take data and turn into a graphic that is something useful and informative. But there's also an emotional component to maps. Maps can also represent our emotional connections to places. Let's also look at another map of Berlin. So we're kind of in the middle of this map, and here are official neighborhood names of this area. These are official government names. But if we crowdsource the same area and maybe ask people what they think about it, we get something a little bit different. This is from Hood Maps, which are crowdsourced neighborhood descriptions, something I also find very amusing. I highly recommend looking this up for your area. It will be terrifyingly accurate. And also, I also was really frustrated with the Berlin weather this week, although right now it's very sunny. So this is the actual Berlin weather, and this is maybe what I created this week while I was making slides and a little annoyed with the weather. So places trigger emotion. All places trigger emotional memories for all of us. Maybe it's your hometown or memories of a vacation or even a place where you had a really painful heartbreak. It's why people move to new cities to start fresh after some big event in their lives. We can feel nostalgic when we visit a place that we lived, or sometimes we even feel discomfort because we remember embarrassing memories from that place. And I really enjoy exploring this connection between maps and places and emotions and finding ways to represent this on paper for myself. So something I do whenever I visit a place or go on a trip, I really like to just draw maps for myself on paper in my own journals. And this sort of act of creating these little personal sketches is a way for me to embed memories about a place and visualize the journey that I took while I was making this trip. So last year, I made a very big journey myself. I made the big decision to move from my home of Denver, Colorado to Berlin, Germany. And I had to deal with a lot of homesickness and emotions during that year. But this homesickness and all these strong emotions inspired a series of experiments that I did to try to explore my feelings with creating maps using R and Clojure. A little bit about Denver, Colorado. It's a medium-sized city in the middle of the US. It sits sort of at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, which I have labeled here. And the Rocky Mountains are a very large mountain range that runs from the middle of Canada to the southern part of the US. It's pretty big. Denver's also a very sunny city. So on average, they get about 300 days of sunshine a year. It's about 1,600 meters above sea level. So it gets pretty extreme weather patterns, and occasionally tornadoes, which I've also, are kind of special about the place. I lived there for almost 8 years, so I spent much of my adult life there, and it was a very formative place for me. During that time, I spent times in the mountains, on hiking trails, driving around the state, and drinking really good coffee, and spending time with really dear people to me. It was a huge part of my life, and my life is a little bit different now in Berlin, since it's a little less mountainous here. But while I was settling in Berlin, I stumbled across this project on Twitter called ReishiAter, and it's an R library that helps users create 3D elevation maps. And I just found this so cool that I ended up digging into creating maps of my own using R and these open source libraries. And I had not played around much with R before, but I learned a couple of things during the process. The really good things about this language is that it has so many well-maintained libraries to deal with geographic file formats, which are kind of unique to making maps in geography. There's also a lot of support for 2D and 3D drawing, and there's a lot of support for it's a language built for statistics, and also it's used a lot in academia and research, so all these libraries have a lot of support behind them, and also years of community work into them. R's community also has libraries that deal with map projections, something that I found very difficult while diving into map making. Map projections are what turn flat 2D coordinates into something that better represents a sphere. So here's Germany with and without any projection, and they look very different. We're not going to go too much into it, but it's an important part of map making. But the downside was I found it's also a very REPL-driven workflow, which plays well with Clojure. But the downside was I found R to be a little bit of an awkward language for me. There were many ways to do things like assigning variables, making for loops, and it was really easy to make mistakes without good error messages for me. But then I ended up finding this library called Clojure. Clojure is a library written by Daniel Slutsky and the SciCloj community to interop Clojure with R. Some cool things about this library: we can pull in R functions from R libraries directly into our Clojure code. We also have support for named arguments, which are used often in R. And it has some functions to support ggplot, which is the main 2D drawing library in R. If you want to dive more into this library and more of the details, I'm going to be using this for just showing examples of it. But if you want to dive more into how behind the scenes, I suggest the GitHub repo and also this talk from Clojure Tray 2019. For the most part, in order to get this working, you need to have an R process running in the back. Clojure talks to R using a library called rserv. And also, most of the libraries, the geo libraries in R, require an external library called gdal. Any sort of, a lot of different geo-type libraries, whether in Python or in Java, require this as a requirement. So let's get into building maps. While this looks like a rectangle, this is actually a map of Colorado. So, it's very simple. But oftentimes when we start building a map, we want to start with a base map of an area. So a base map provides users some background information of where we are. So to this, looks like a rectangle, but for some of us, this is home. Luckily in R, there's already a library built in that has a lot of coordinates for country borders and also US state borders, appropriately called maps. some descriptions of what's happening here. We're just calling a function called mapData to get the state border for Colorado, and we're loading into something called a data frame. A data frame, in simple terms, is a 2D dimensional array-like structure with named columns, like a table. But data frames also make it easier for our users to filter and apply functions to columns of data. And using a function like summary, we can see all the columns that we have available to us. So we have latitude and longitude for our state border. To plot the map, I'm using a library called ggplot. And from there, I can build layers of the plot one by one. So the first line, we're initializing a ggplot object, and the next line, we're calling a function called geonPolygon that takes that Colorado data frame, takes the latitude and longitude, and finds and plots it to our main plot. So we get this rectangle. But we can add some more to this map so it doesn't look like you're staring at a gray rectangle. If we want to add more data to this map, we might want to look for external sources. Oftentimes, when you start Googling for geographic data, you'll get you'll get a file format called a shapefile. Shapefiles contain vector points. Think vector data. Think points, lines, and shapes. They often come in a zip format with other required files, and they're binary encoded. So I have a library in R called SF that has functions for us to deal with shapefiles. We can read a shapefile and then also turn that to another data frame called Colorado water. Taking that previous plot of just Colorado we can just add another line below the geonPolygon function that we had before and add the lakes as the water as another layer. So now we get Colorado plus all the bodies of water in Colorado. Because this shapefile gets loaded as a data frame, we can also apply filters to this data thanks to the data frame functions. A lot of these bodies of water don't have any names, so they're probably pretty small lakes scattered around the state. So if I wanted to highlight the lakes, the bodies of water with names, I might split them up into different groups using R, and then color them a different color. So here I'm only coloring the bodies of water with names as blue, and everything else is just a light gray. The SF library also lets us crop an area, and so we can actually apply a geographic, sort of a filter to it to just zero in on a specific area of a state. Here, on many weekends, I spent traveling to a place called Rocky Mountain National Park, which is a national park about 2 hours from Denver. It's really beautiful. It's also very secluded and away from a lot of technology. I highly recommend it if you're ever in the area. So using a function from the same SF library, we can crop out that area in red. So in Clojure, I created a bounding box with just stating the x and y min and x and y max for the bounding box. I applied that bounding box to that Colorado water data frame, and then I plotted it again. And this is what that area looks like, just cropped. We can repeat this process for other shapefiles that we find on the internet. I found a shapefile of the park boundaries, and I also found a shapefile of all the trails in Rocky Mountain National Park. And by repeating the process of reading and then plotting it in ggplot, we can create a more cohesive map. So my favorite part of this park is this little corner in the southwest here. This is Lake Granby, or the lake on the bottom, the one that's cut off, is called Lake Granby. And there's another lake in that area also called Grand Lake. I wanted to recreate some of the views I saw from there. When you're there, you have this gorgeous, large lake in front of you, and you have the mountains in the back. So I wanted to start looking into 3D representations of this data. This is where Raster Files and our library called ReishiAter comes in. So raster files are image files with data in each pixel, and the data can include things like, raster files are used for things like temperature, radar information, cloud cover, and in this case, elevation. This is different from a shapefile, which contain vectors of data. As for ReishiAter, ReishiAter is an amazing R library that, in short, lets users create these 3D plots. There's a main function. There's so much that goes on in the library, but there's this main function called SphereShader that basically mimics how light hits a slope. So the light hits differently based on the steepness of a slope rather than coloring an elevation based on the value of that elevation. So if we even change the angle, the same elevation file looks different. And this kind of represents how the sun, when it goes around an area, makes it look different. It also includes shaders for layering shadows to create more stylistic and realistic plots. It's a really cool library. I have links to it later in here. It's a little too much to go in depth in it right now. So these plots before that were generated by ReishiAter are all 2D, but it also ties into an R library called RGL, which lets us render in 3D and helps us render to OpenGL and also other formats. So that same area of Rocky Mountain National Park now looks like this with the elevation raster file applied to it. So those two lakes, I wanted to focus in on those areas. With ReishiAter, we can change the camera theta, which is the horizontal position of the camera around an object. The phi parameter changes the vertical position. And combining the two, we can sort of maneuver the camera to focus on the area that we want. Something that happens when you take a picture is if we want to focus in on an area like the foreground or the background, we can blur certain parts of the picture. And ReishiAter has functions that include that, allow you to blur and focus on different parts. So I wanted to recreate that feeling of blurring out the background, blurring out the mountains. So we can change the focus and the focal length to create our final picture, which unfortunately I didn't make a slide of. Oh, this is embarrassing. This is close. So I also repeated that process to highlight another part of the park I really enjoyed called Long's Peak. It's this kind of intimidating peak that you can see actually from Denver and other parts of the metro area. It's the tallest peak in Rocky Mountain National Park, and it's also a really difficult hike that usually takes a good part of a day to finish. And so I wanted to play around with render depth and the focus to kind of highlight how highlight this peak. I couldn't get the result I wanted, but yeah, these techniques are available to anyone who wants to use it in ReishiAter. Other things that ReishiAter also provides that kind of help you highlight your visualization. There's labels. You can also change textures and colors. This is an area called Black Canyon of the Gunnison in Colorado. It's definitely a more deserty type area. And so you can change the color to represent that. You can also overlay images. This was not created in R, but it was created with a very similar technique using other technology, taking a raster file and then overlaying it with a vintage topographic map, and then you get a really cool effect. You can kind of make these old maps come to life. So all the code is available on GitHub. This was a really fun experiment for me to do. It was really fun to be exposed to all these technologies in R and then learn about the wonderful developments in that community. So the Clojure library opens up a lot of possibilities in the Clojure library to use these other open source libraries while allowing us to still keep with our Clojure development environment. Something I found while writing this, once I got everything set up with Clojure, I was able to easily use Clojure for all my boring tasks, things like managing all my data sources and generating all these GIFs and outputs. And it was pretty easy to link into R. And so it was a very pleasant development experience. But most importantly, it was really fun to explore different ways to see my old home. And if you're feeling nostalgic about your own hometown, please feel free to change, to clone this and change out all the data sources with your own. While I have some sources for US-based data sources on the repo. If you have any questions on how to find data sources in Europe and beyond, please feel free to contact me. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for taking us on this journey of maps and memories. Do we have any questions? Yes.
I was actually curious about how the actual data is collected. Like, does someone walk around with a GPS device, or like all the water bodies in Colorado, for example? How do we figure that out?
I think it's a lot of satellite, actually. So the raster files are actually from satellite data sources, and there's usually metadata on the shape files that tells you how they collect it, because that is like accuracy, and it's like citing basically your data source, but your data source is outside. So it varies from data source to data source, but there's usually metadata and shape files that help you figure that out. I actually don't know where all this comes entirely where all this comes from.
Thanks.
Do you also get the altitude data along with the file that you downloaded?
With the raster file, yes.
No, I think in the shape files, because you need the height to plot it to the exact point in the raster files. No?
Shape files don't have elevation data, but you can combine the two. Something that I didn't show actually, using the R's raster library, you can actually get elevation from a point. So if you have like the raster file loaded, you can actually query it to get the elevation for a specific coordinate.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
So you mentioned this is a very enjoyable environment to use R in, but I was wondering if you could recommend this tool to like dedicated R programmers. Is this like a clear upgrade over just R alone, or is this like an easy way for Clojure developers to use R specifically?
For me, it's an easy way for Clojure developers to use R. Because even as a Clojure developer, sometimes it was easier for me to just open up my R environment and just run something, because I still had to like I still had to start up R server, and then I had to open up my Emacs, and then I had to like get everything up and running. So there's still like, it's not a lot of overhead, but it's still some.
Cool.
Great, thank you. So give another hand of applause to Joanne.